That's kind of like the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, kind of how we got them validated. And the question is, why are they important, right? Like, why are you here? Why did I spend months preparing this and Dan, bothered to contact me to bring me back out here to do all of this? Like, why are they that important? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And I'm going to talk about them. This is my wonderful timeline that I made. It's really, really cheesy and really, really crude. And it's not to scale at all. But, so for those of you in here who are OCD about wanting things to be scaled and accurate and straight and even, I apologize in advance. Sorry, Jim. The traditional Hebrew text is called the Masoretic text, okay? I'm going to have to teach you some words, so keep up if you can. The Masoretic text, there's a group of Jews called the Masoretes. The Masoretes wrote the Masoretic text. They kind of standardized how we translate the Old Testament, okay? So instead of saying one Bible translator says, Jack and Jill went up the hill. Another Bible translator says Jill and Jack went up the hill. Upon the hill arose Jill and Jack. For the King James Jews. The Masorete, they standardized it, like Henry Ford style, like made everything the same, okay? And that became the traditional text. Those of you in here who use your King James, New King James, MEV, NASB, the Leningrad Codex is your main foundation of the Old Testament, okay? The Leningrad Codex is the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament we have today, with one exception, which is always an exception. I'll get to that in a minute. But all your Bibles in here, those of you who use your King James or some child of the King James, the Leningrad Codex, again, Bible, discovered in Leningrad. See how they name these things? Russia, for those of you younger folks who don't know where that is. It's 1,000 years after Christ. Do you understand why those scholars in the 17 and 1800 and even the 19 and today are so critical of the Old Testament before the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because the oldest Old Testament that we had is 1,000 years after Jesus. Complete. There are others that are pages. People would put Bible verses on jewelry. We have fragments. We might have a page or a verse here. We might have a book where, like, there's the Codex Aleppo, but it's only like 60% of the Old Testament. But I mean, oldest complete Genesis to Malachi book, and it's 1,000 years after Jesus. And it's not to say that the translation stopped. It's just things wear out. Okay? I bought this Bible. This was the first Bible I bought when I got saved 22 years ago. I don't know if you can tell, but like Luke and John and Acts are literally held together by Scotch tape. It's falling apart. Okay? I have many Bibles. In fact, my favorite Bible is wonderful, leather bound. I love it. It's great. But I keep this one for sentimental value because it's the first one I ever bought. It's the first one I got as a Christian. It's the first Bible that I read the whole way through. All of my first notes are in there, and I'm kind of actually a little too lazy to copy them into other. So I keep it around. But it's only been 20 years. What do you do when it's 2,000 years? Okay, my grandfather died in 2003. I got his Bible. I didn't bring it with me because I didn't want to risk ruining it on the plane. Okay, it was published in 1961 or 62, I think. It looks like it's from the 1700s. It survived his house fire, barely. It is old and it looks worn down. Those of you in here who were my students at MCS, I've showed you this Bible before. You know how old that thing looks. My grandfather poured his life into that Bible. But it looks like it's from the 1700s, even though it's only 60 years old. It's crazy. So, coming back to where we left off. You mentioned the Greek Septuagint earlier, right? There's an Egyptian king, I'll call him a pharaoh, but an Egyptian king, Ptolemy II. About 250 BC, he gets a bunch of Jewish rabbis together and have them translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek, because how everyone speaks English today, everyone spoke Greek back then, right? It was the second language of the world. You get a Portuguese person, you get a Japanese person, and a person from Hungary. Those three people probably are not speaking Portuguese, Japanese, and Hungarian. But I bet all three of them can talk to each other in English. The same was true in the ancient world, but only it was Greek. So he wanted non-Jewish people to be able to read the Bible. And practically most Jews read Greek anyway, spoke Greek more than they spoke Hebrew at that time anyway. But the oldest copy we have of that, complete copy, again, keyword here, complete, is the Codex Sinaiticus, which there's a Catholic church where the Catholics think Mount Sinai was, and they found a copy of the Greek Septuagint there, as well as the New Testament in Greek as well. And much in the same way that Jehovah's Witnesses, how they took the King James Bible, and the Jehovah's Witnesses crossed out all the verses that they don't like and all the verses that disagree with their theology, the Samaritans kind of did the same thing with the Jewish writing thousands of years ago. They took the Masoretic text and they got rid of or changed the verses they didn't like. So even the heretical copies that we have of the Old Testament from the Samaritans, they are also about 1,000 years after Christ. So here's the point. We have no BC copies of the Old Testament until 1947. Okay? A la Dead Sea Scrolls. Why? Because humans, disaster, life, right? So there is still this unbroken line of transmission. Don't get me wrong, we're still making copies of the Bible. It's just, we've lost them. Things wear out. So, if you can't remember anything that I said, just remember it like this. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the only Old Testament copy that we have that exists today from the Second Temple era, from BC times, that have been preserved up to modernity, up to modern times. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the only BC copy we have of the Old Testament that are still mostly intact. Okay, again, fragments, medallions, jewelry have some verses on them. Psalm 91. There's a lot of people who would inscribe verses from Psalm 91, protection from God and all that on jewelry, but not whole books. Every book of the Bible minus Esther, and multiple, not just one copy, but multiple copies too, right? And then like the great scroll of Isaiah. Now, the Masoretic text, the Codex Leningrad, is the oldest, mostly. However, because, the inconvenience of my PowerPoint thinking that it's done, and then God shows me something new, so I get to add another slide. Hooray. 2 years ago, there was an auction. I didn't know about this, but in Israel, a copy of the Bible, Old Testament, sold for $38 million. Okay? It was bought by a former U.S. ambassador. He's a Jewish guy. And why is because this codex, this book of the Old Testament, is 100 to 150 years older than Leningrad. And it's nearly complete. Of 800 pages, it's only missing 8. 792 pages of the Bible, sheepskin, handwritten, line by line, verse by verse, in Hebrew, older. So that this is now the oldest complete copy in Hebrew that we have of the Old Testament, not including some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. Again, others like Aleppo and other, missing 40%. So what is that? Maybe we'll call that like $20 million. You can sell Aleppo for $20 million. So pretty cool. So again, get on a plane, head to Israel, and you can go see that. He bought it and then he donated it to a museum. He's like 92. He doesn't care. If he can spend $38 million on a Bible, and he's 90 something years old, it's just money at that point, right? And then you just give it away. So again, I've said this. I just want to reiterate the point. What happened to all the scrolls? Why do we have some that are from the 700s or 800s? Why do we celebrate? Right? Life happens, right? Fire happens. All of the scrolls that were in Israel, they were in Jerusalem. When the Romans showed up in 70 AD, Titus burned it to the ground. The temple was, all the gold that was on the temple walls, all that fire melted it, right? In between the rocks. The gold became the mortar in the rocks. So when Jesus says not one stone would be left upon another, well, what motivates men to move hundreds of pounds of rocks so that one isn't left upon another? The melted gold in between the rocks. But all the paper that was inside those buildings, it burns. And so all those copies that we had, we lost. Now, we didn't lose everything, praise God, but we lost a lot. The libraries of Alexandria, very famous, right? Their brag was that anything that had ever been written down in the ancient world, they had a copy of it, right? It was the Library of Congress for that ancient time. Well, if you're going to build a library, please don't build it in the middle of Egypt, in one of the most volatile and violent places in the world. I mean, how many armies go through Egypt, right? It's like building a library in Grand Central Station. Like, you got people going through all the time. In 350 years, fire, war, invasion, tsunami, earthquakes. Example, Julius Caesar, he shows up in 48 AD BC. He's trying to take over Alexandria from the Egyptians. And he accidentally burns part of the library to the ground. Okay? And anywhere between 40 to 70,000. You're like, that's a really big number. Well, the people who love Caesar said they were covering for him and said, well, he only burned 40,000 accidentally. The people who hated him exaggerated and said, no, he burned 700,000 and he did it on purpose. So, in case you wonder if politics has changed any, your friends and your allies downplay your mistakes and your enemies exaggerate your mistakes. So maybe the reality is something in the middle. So for those of you who wonder, no, politics hasn't changed. And Rome finally got what was coming to them, right? All the documents that were probably written in Rome. I mean, Rome got attacked many times, but the most destructive was the Vandals, right? 455, the Vandals show up. Rome was a shell of her former glory. I mean, she was really nothing by this point. And they destroy Rome so thoroughly, so completely, that we use the Vandals became a verb. They vandalize, vandalism. So when a noun becomes a verb, you know something has happened, right? And so here's my point. The ancient world is a violent, harsh place. Not that today is any different, but at least most things are digital today. Fires, disasters, man-made, natural, okay? It was all common. And when you have all this fire and all this destruction, things made of paper or papyrus, whatever, scrolls, books, they're not going to have a very long shelf life. Yes, pun is intended. I thought it was funny. Put it in there. Remind me next time to show you the PowerPoint. You can tell me if the jokes are going to land or not. Okay, I'll take them out. Here's the bigger key point. Okay, here I think is maybe the more important one. Not just the fact that we have BC copies of the Old Testament, but they show that the Old Testament has not been altered. It hasn't been tampered with. The Bible is not a game of telephone, okay, where I tell one person on this side of the room something, and by the time it gets over here, it's completely changed, maybe with one word being the same, and the other 25 words have all changed. You have this consistency, right? Well, we can only go back to 1000 AD. We can't prove the Old Testament's reliable beyond. The Dead Sea Scrolls push it back 1,200 years. We can go back to BC times, and we can say that before Christ, the scriptures, they didn't change, okay? Now, yes, do the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, do they use different words, different synonyms, different syntax? Sure. Again, it goes Jill and Jack and Jill. Same thing. And this is really no different. Now, people try to make a big deal of this, and this is why I'm harping on this, right? But it's really not a big deal. We do this today with our Bible translations, right? Here's just an example. Think of like the King James, which is like, for those of you who know how Bible translation works, King James is like word for word. It's like way over here on the literal side. Then the NLT, the New Living Translation, is like way over here for the thought for thought idea. Here's Romans 6:1 of the exact same verse, right? What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin, that grace may abound? God forbid. NLT says, well then, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of his wonderful grace? Of course not. Now those sentences are very different as far as the syntax and the words and the style. But they both say exactly the same thing in their meaning. We cannot abuse God's grace just so we can go and sin more. Hey, if I go out and break all those 10 commandments, I'll do it so that I can get more of God's grace. No. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. I'm not going to go on sinning so that I can abuse God's kindness. They both say the same thing. It's just one says it for one group of people, and the other one says it for a younger audience. And most translations are in the middle, somewhere in there. But it's the same idea. Septuagint, Dead Sea Scrolls, Masoretic, they're all saying the same thing. They're just saying it in different ways. And some books are rearranged differently, like Jeremiah as an example, like chapter 25 through 30 in your Bible is going to be like chapter 45 through 47 if you have like an Orthodox Bible or a Septuagint Bible. So if any of you are like an Orthodox tradition. So some of the chapters are in different places, but all the verses are there. So you have the whole alphabet. It's just some of the letters are switched around. But that's it. It's not a big deal. It's still all there. So, the effect of that, early Christians did not change the Old Testament to make it look more Jesus-friendly. Okay? Well, if we just change Isaiah 53 or Psalm 22 and we make them look more messianic-y and we make them look more Jesus-friendly, we can say that Jesus is the Messiah and no one will ever know because no one has any copies of the Old Testament. No. Dead Sea Scrolls, 250 years before Jesus. At most, 125 before Jesus or so, at least. Isaiah 53, 125 BC. Exactly the same thing. So, the early Christians did not go in and change anything to make the Old Testament look more Jesus-friendly. It was already Jesus-friendly. And the Jews did not go and change to make it look like, ooh, we gave a prophecy, but it didn't come to pass. We better go back and change it retroactively so it looks like that our prophet was accurate. So we'll change the prophecy to say what actually happened, and we'll get rid of all those first edition failures, and our second edition will look supernatural. You think I'm joking, but no, I'm serious. Like, this is what some scholars are arguing for, that the Jews changed it, right? I'm going to give you an example. The book of Daniel. After the book of Genesis and like creation and Big Bang and evolution and all that, the most highly debated book, second most debated book, is Daniel. Because the prophecies in Daniel are so crazy precise, especially like in chapter 11. Chapter 7 too. But chapter 11, it's ridiculous. Now, most of you, if you've ever read Daniel 11, you probably got really confused by it if you didn't have a commentary or if you didn't have a good knowledge of ancient Greek history. But I'm going to give you some examples. But this is how the argument of Daniel is framed, okay? Is Daniel a history book that pretends to be a prophecy book, or is Daniel a biography, autobiography, that is also prophetic? Okay? So think about this. If I walk into any high school in America and I grab a U.S. history textbook off the shelf, I can open up that U.S. history textbook and I can be like, oh, there's the Revolutionary War, there's the Civil War, oh, Abe Lincoln died, that's sad. World War I, World War II, 9/11. And I stand up in front of all of you and I say, guys, I have a book and it predicted the entire history of America before it happened. And you'd be like, the book in your hand that says copyright 2020? No. Right? When history is written in advance, it's prophecy. When history is written after the fact, it's history. Okay? When it's happening, it's current event. And this is what the one argument is making about Daniel, right? They say that Daniel had to be written after these prophetic events, and that Daniel is probably not even a real person. He's just a mythical character like King Arthur or Robin Hood or something. And that it's pretending to be prophecy when in reality it's just history. Now, if I went to Mount Vernon, George Washington's house, and I pulled some book off the bookshelf and it opened up a secret door. This is the best analogy I could think of, so bear with me on this. And I go down into the secret corridor of Mount Vernon that no one's ever been before, and I find George Washington's private library and his private desk and his private office. And I'm like, ooh, George Washington's desk. And I open the drawer and I find George Washington's diary, and I open it up and I start reading. And it says July 4th, 1776, because why not, right? I had a vision last night. An angel from God came to me and told me we will win the war, but 7 years later, there will be a crazy civil war. And 100 some years after that, there will be a whole world war, and then another world war, and then 2 ships with wings will crash into 2 giant buildings in the year 2001. You'd be like, whoa, George Washington diary is predicting the future 200 years in advance. That would be amazing. If I went and got the best paper expert from the 1700s and be like, oh, yep, this is indeed paper written from the 1700s. And I went and I got an ink expert who can be like, yep, this is the exact kind of ink they would have used in the 1700s. And I went and found some guy who has read all 20,000 of George Washington's letters, and he knows how George Washington writes, and he knows how George Washington's handwriting, he knows what his handwriting looks like. They're handwriting experts. And he compares this George Washington prophecy journal to all 20,000 of those letters and be like, yep, handwriting matches. And then because we live in 2025, we scan everything onto a computer and some AI program says, yep, these are identical. With all of that evidence, the paper, the ink, the computer, the handwriting experts, they all say this is authentic. George Washington indeed prophesied the future. Still, most of the world would not believe, even with all that evidence. Why? Because then they would have to admit there is a supernatural world. And that is, in a nutshell, the book of Daniel. If Daniel was written in advance, it's prophecy. If Daniel was written after the fact, it's a history book pretending to be prophecy. Okay? All of that to give you another one of my wonderfully crudely and inaccurately, not to scale lines drawn, timelines. The life of Daniel happens roughly there. Now, Daniel was born before 600. Yes, he dies after 550. But is that 50-year window when most of the events of the book of Daniel take place? Okay, fiery furnace, lion's den, Nebuchadnezzar, all that stuff. All of that's typically happening within that time frame. After that, the Jews go back home, Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, and then the final prophets, okay, Haggai, Malachi, Zechariah, they do their writings. The last one being Malachi. About 397 BC, we finish the Old Testament canon. That leads to what many of you are familiar with, what we call the 400 years of silence, okay? Allegedly. God is still speaking. And Daniel, in that time, the book of Daniel prophesies the rise and fall of Babylon, the rise and fall of Persia, the rise and fall of Greece, the rise and fall of Rome. He predicts all of that. And very importantly for our conversation, chapter 11 of Daniel, he prophesies the destruction, the desolation, not destruction, but the desolation, the unholy act that was perpetrated upon the temple, the abomination of desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes IV, this Greek king, he's not very important to history, but in Jewish history, he's like their prototype Antichrist, okay? We have Hanukkah because of, well, the Jews have Hanukkah because of him, okay? He's the one who goes into the temple, he opens up the Holy of Holies, moves the curtain, he goes in there and he sacrifices a pig on the altar, because you all know how much Jews love pigs. He brings in a statue of Zeus into the temple. He turns the outer courtyard into a brothel. And he makes the Sabbath illegal. And he forbids reading the Bible, Torah. This is going to cause a huge war that we call the Maccabean revolts. Judah Maccabees, the hammer, all that stuff. All that stuff is happening in the 160s BC. And Daniel prophesies all of it. This is that George Washington letter that I'm comparing it to, right? And so these are the two schools of thought. Did Daniel come after the fact, where it's history posing as prophecy, or did he actually live? Was he a real person? He's not a myth. And did he live and did he write it back in the 500s? And you can imagine which side most scholars, particularly secular scholars, and some Bible scholars, sadly, came down on for a long time. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls come along and kind of upset their apple cart. Because of the 8 copies of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them come from after 100. Okay? However, 1, maybe 2, the second one they're not quite sure about, but the one for sure, the one copy of Daniel that they have, that it's not even a complete copy, but it has chapter 11, it is written before 200 AD. So that means that copy of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls from before 200 AD shows you that Daniel was written before the events of Antiochus. Even if you pretend that Daniel didn't write Daniel, and he didn't write in 500, someone pretending to be Daniel or whatever wrote before Antiochus. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls help to prove. Okay, let me show you an example of how grainy, like how detailed some of these things are. Everything in black is the Bible verse. Everything in red is me helping you understand the pronouns. And everything in purple is me giving you the history. Okay, here's just 2 examples of how crazy ridiculous Daniel is predicting hundreds of years in advance Greek history at this time. All of this is post-Alexander the Great, for those of you who want some kind of timeline piece. Okay? After some years, they shall make an alliance, the daughter, Bernice, of the king of the south, Ptolemy II of Egypt. He's the guy who does the Septuagint. He shall come to the king of the north, Antiochus II, and they shall make an agreement. Okay? Egypt and Syria were fighting a war. Now, Israel is writing north of Israel, Syria, south of Israel, Egypt. Okay? And Ptolemy and Antiochus, they fight a war. Neither is winning, so they make peace. And in the ancient world, when you make peace treaties, the way that you make sure that those peace treaties don't get broken is through marriage. Some royal daughter will marry some royal male, son, whoever, and with that marriage, you have a peace treaty. Okay? But she, Bernice, she shall not retain her power, and he, referring to Antiochus, his power shall not endure. But she shall be betrayed, and her attendants, and her father, and those who supported her in those times. So what happened? Historically, Antiochus divorced his wife, Laodice, in order to marry Bernice. Hell have no fury like a woman scorned. I'm divorcing you, honey, so I can go marry this younger, better-looking girl from Egypt. For the good of the kingdom. For the good of the kingdom. Laodice did not like this. So she pretended to be friends with Bernice and to be all nice to her face, but she poisoned her and all of her attendants and her ex-husband. And then later that year, her father died as well. So here's Daniel, and this is an angel talking, but here's Daniel recording this prophecy 200 to 300 years before it happened, to that level of detail. And he does Alexander the Great, he prophesies him, he prophesies the fall of Persia. And coming to Antiochus, most of chapter 11, at least the second half of chapter 11, is about Antiochus, right? And the war and the temple and all of that. Here's just one verse about Antiochus. And in his place shall arise a contemptible person, Antiochus Epiphanes, to whom royal majesty had not been given. Okay? So Seleucus IV, a few hundred years have passed. Seleucus IV has just died. His son should become the next king. However, Seleucus thought it would be a good idea to take on Rome, which is a stupid idea. Rome crushes him and then takes his son as a hostage to ensure that Seleucus will become their puppet state and will never try to disobey them again. Seleucus dies. His younger brother, Antiochus, takes over. He takes the throne for himself. He wasn't really in line for the throne. Royal majesty had not been given to him. He wasn't in line for the throne. But he takes it by being all nicey nice to Rome. He basically just kisses their butt and promises to do everything they say if they agree to recognize his claim to the throne. Right? If some dictator takes over in some third world country, what do they want? They want America to recognize them as being the legitimate ruler. Because if America recognizes him as the legitimate ruler, then all the other countries will too. That's what Rome was at that time. If Rome says yes, everyone else will as well. And so he sweet talks his way into power. Now eventually, he will get uppity, and Rome will come and will crush him as well, but we're a few years away from that. So again, here is Greek history being written in advance. We know it's written in advance because the Dead Sea Scrolls prove it. So, if you can't remember anything that I just said, please understand this one simple fact. We have at least one copy of Daniel from around 200 BC, give or take. Others come from later, that prove that Daniel was written before the events of Antiochus and not after. In other words, prophecy before it happened. History before it happened, not after. I'm going to quote this guy who basically just observed the same thing that we observed, only he's a smart guy and he said it way more intelligently than I did, way back in 1992. This is how he put it, speaking about the Essenes. He says, it's very difficult to perceive that one single desert community, the Essenes, should have preserved such a significant number of Daniel manuscripts if it had already been produced at so late a date. The large number of manuscripts in this community can much better be explained if one accepts an earlier origin of Daniel than the one proposed by the Maccabean hypothesis of the historical critical scholarship. Those are the ones who say that Daniel is history pretending to be prophecy. So, what he's saying in non-PhD language is, hey, Essene guys, we have some copies of Daniel. Cool. Yeah, oh yeah, he's talking about Antiochus. He's talking about the fall of Persia and Greece and the rise of Rome. This already happened, we know. Like, why are you giving us a history book? What, this history book is pretending to be a prophecy book? Like, what? They wouldn't be interested in it. Like, if you have a brand new book that is a history book, and that history book is pretending to be a prophecy book, no one's going to be interested in it except some nerdy people. However, because there are so many copies of it, and only 8 have survived, but we knew that they had more than just those 8. If they have so many copies of Daniel, that means there's interest. And it's about supply and demand. Like, oh my gosh, guys, this stuff in Antiochus, the temple being destroyed, and Daniel prophesied all that before it happened. Like, I have it right here. No, I want to read it. No, let me read it. I'm next. No, me. No, I want to read it. Give me a copy. Come back in a few days. I will make copies for everyone. I'll make 10 copies, and you can share, and I'll make more, right? The more copies you have, prove that the demand was higher. Therefore, to the Essenes, this was written before 160. It's written before 200. They could look at the book of Daniel and know that he wrote it centuries ago and be like, whoa, I want to read this. Let me make some more copies so everyone can read it. I told you to put a pin in 250 BC because AI has to ruin my PowerPoint, but in a good way. So like 2 weeks ago, literally just 2 weeks ago, there were all these news headlines. Maybe you saw them online or Facebook or something on. Some scholars wrote an AI program, and they call it Enoch because why not, right? Because information never dies. That one worked. Okay, good. You got that one. If you didn't get that one, you need to read Genesis more. And basically what this AI did was study the paper, study the ink, and the AI basically just said, yeah, those guys back in 1940 and 50, Albright and those guys, they did a good job with the technology that they had at the time, but actually it's older than 250 BC. It actually could be at least 300 BC, maybe even going back to 340 in the case of one. And that there are scrolls that were written in the 100s that, no, they were actually written in the 200s. So the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just push back 1,200 years, they've pushed it back 1,300 years or even more, getting us closer to the original as we can go. So here's AI being used for something good, to show that the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually older than we first thought. Some of the headlines, Smithsonian was talking about it, some different archaeology ones, the Times of Israel. New study, revolutionary Dead Sea Scrolls may rewrite Israel's history. Headlines, right? Now,